Imagine if the world's most feared bounty hunter, a guy whose literal job description was to track down and eliminate a movement, suddenly became its leader. That is the insane, true story of the Apostle Paul. Before he wrote half the New Testament, his name was Saul. And he wasn't just a critic. He was a highly educated, fiercely zealous Pharisee hunting down early Christians. Saul was born a Roman citizen, fluent in multiple languages, and trained by the top rabbi of his day. To fit in with the working class, he picked up tent making so he wouldn't owe anyone a dime. To fit in with the Romans and Greeks, he started using his Roman name, Paul. He went from causing the scars on others to bearing the physical scars of persecution himself. The biggest takeaway: your past, your weird skills, and even your mistakes aren't wasted. If God could repurpose a literal persecutor into history's greatest missionary, think about what he can do with your story.
When we think about historical figures who literally shaped the course of Western civilization, it's so easy to just imagine them as these physically imposing heroes with straightforward, legendary origin stories, right? Well, as we'll see today by unpacking the historical records from his own letters and the book of Acts, Paul's pre-Christian life was anything but simple. Actually, his birthplace, his elite education, his family heritage, and even his incredibly gritty blue-collar day job all wove together to create the absolute ultimate, if completely unlikely, candidate for his future mission. Okay, let's just shatter a massive misconception right off the bat. When you picture Paul, you probably envision this towering, commanding, booming orator holding a crowd captive. But listen to this brutal review from his ancient critics in 2 Corinthians. They actually dismissed him, saying his bodily presence was weak and his speech was of no account. Ouch! He was absolutely not a physically imposing superhero. In fact, his actual in-person speaking abilities were looked down upon by his opponents. And early, albeit apocryphal, 2nd century descriptions paint a really specific, almost unflattering picture. They describe a guy of little stature, thin-haired, with crooked legs and a hooked nose. Now, add to that the fact that he carried out his work through severe chronic physical infirmity. He openly mentioned suffering terrible illnesses like when he was preaching in Galatia. Plus, his body undoubtedly bore the permanent, brutal scars of lashings, beatings, and literally being stoned. Yet here's the kicker. Paul never saw this physical frailty as a disqualification. No way! He saw this profound weakness as the absolute authenticating mark of his ministry. That brings us to Section 1, a citizen of two worlds. Let's look at his Jewish and Roman roots and see how this physically unassuming man was perfectly positioned to bridge two entirely different cultures. First things first, we need to clear up a super common myth. You've probably heard that his name was miraculously changed from Saul, the bad guy who persecuted the church, to Paul, the good guy, right after his conversion. Actually, that's just not true. He held both names simultaneously his entire life. Saul was his Jewish name, honoring his deep heritage from the tribe of Benjamin, just like Israel's very first king Saul. Paul, on the other hand, was his Roman cognomen, his personal name, which he received at birth. So he didn't drop one name for the other. Rather, he just started using his Roman name, Paul, way more consistently when he strategically shifted his focus to navigating his ministry among the Gentiles. It's like he held two totally different passports, giving him an incredibly unique social standing. On one hand, he had this unshakable Jewish heritage. He proudly called himself a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, and raised by a strictly observant father. But at the exact same time, he possessed immense Roman privileges as a born citizen of Tarsus. And Tarsus wasn't some backwater town. It was a major, highly cosmopolitan, international center of learning. He didn't have to buy this citizenship. He was born into it, which gave him massive legal rights. Combine that with his life status as a single man, perhaps a widower, and he had the exact perfect flexibility required for constant, highly dangerous travel. Let's transition over to Section 2, Scholar and Laborer. This is a look at a man who was simultaneously brilliant and gritty. We're exploring a mind that beautifully, and kind of paradoxically, blended elite academia with rough blue-collar work. So before anything else, Paul was a scholar of the absolute highest order. He was a Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were this incredibly influential, deeply respected group committed strictly to both the written law of Moses and all the unwritten oral traditions. Paul didn't just casually attend a local synagogue school. He was educated in Jerusalem under the famous, highly esteemed Rabbi Gamaliel. Think of it like going to an Ivy League school and being mentored by the top professor in the field. He advanced way beyond his peers, operating at the very top of his class with an intense, burning zeal. We know from his later writings that he had massive portions, maybe even the entirety of the Old Testament, completely memorized. But his massive intellect wasn't just confined to Jewish law. Paul possessed an absolute linguistic arsenal. I mean, he had a total mastery of Hebrew for the Old Testament texts. He was incredibly fluent in Greek, which he used not only to write, but to just casually drop quotes from Greek poets like Epimenides and Aratus, and even debate Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in the public square. Plus, he spoke Aramaic, the common tongue of Jews in Palestine. And he almost certainly spoke Latin, the language of the Western Roman Empire, which was totally essential for his travels. This unparalleled linguistic toolkit equipped him perfectly for vast international movement. Okay, but here is the great paradox. We have this elite, multilingual Pharisee who was educated by Gamaliel, so why in the world was he working as a manual laborer making tents? To us today, it seems shocking, but it was actually customary for learned Pharisees to learn a physical trade. Paul likely picked up tent making from his father, and he utilized it for 3 highly strategic reasons. First off, it allowed him to maintain total financial independence. Second, it completely distinguished him from the many, let's just say, financially predatory traveling teachers of the ancient world. He wanted to offer his message completely free of charge. And third, it allowed him to model gritty, blue-collar hard work and diligence for the everyday people he was teaching. Now we have to arrive at Section 3, the fierce persecutor. We really must address his dark past, because honestly, we cannot fully understand Paul without looking at the violent religious zeal that originally drove him. Listen to his own stark admission from 1 Timothy. He calls his former self a blasphemer, a persecutor, and insolent opponent. Because of his extreme Pharisaical zeal, he viewed Jesus of Nazareth, who, remember, was executed by the Romans, as a dangerous traitor and a blasphemer. He literally could not bear the idea that this figure was being worshipped as the Messiah. Because of this, he violently and systematically attacked the early Christian church. He thought he was the good guy. He was on a ferocious, seemingly unstoppable trajectory, basically a freight train of religious zeal. But Paul's campaign of intense persecution was brought to a swift, abrupt, and absolute halt only by his sudden, transformative encounter with the risen Lord on the road to Damascus. In a single instant, his entire life was completely upended. Which brings us to our final act, Section 4, Prepared by Providence. How do all these seemingly disjointed pieces, the physical weakness, the dual citizenship, the elite education, the tent making, and even that violent past, how does it all come together? Well, they were completely and brilliantly repurposed. So the absolutely crucial point here is that grace didn't erase Paul's past. Instead, it completely repurposed it. Just look at how divine providence had prepared him literally from the womb. His Roman citizenship wasn't just some fancy status symbol. He legally invoked it to avoid unjust punishments and prolong his preaching rights, even famously appealing to Caesar to extend his ministry all the way to Rome. His intense Pharisaic training, that fueled his ability to make profound, bulletproof, scripture-backed theological arguments. His immense language skills and knowledge of Greek philosophy allowed him to cross cultural borders all over the known world. And that humble tent-making trade, it funded an itinerant ministry completely free of charge, giving him unquestionable integrity. God took every single aspect of his heritage, his education, and his vocation, and used it to make him the ultimate apostle to the Gentiles. So, what does this all mean for us? That brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this explainer. Just as Paul's entirely unique, seemingly contradictory background, and yes, even his deepest, darkest regrets were powerfully transformed and utilized, we have to look inward. How can the details, the random skills, and the specific experiences of your own life be repurposed for a greater mission? Whether it's your education, your day job, your unique cultural background, or maybe even your past mistakes, nothing is wasted when it's redirected toward a higher purpose.
Over the years, Saul, now known as Paul, would carry the gospel across the Roman Empire. He traveled thousands of miles, He planted churches. He preached in synagogues, marketplaces, prisons, and public squares. He endured beatings, shipwrecks, imprisonment, hunger, rejection, and constant danger. Yet he refused to stop. Why? Because he had seen the risen Christ. Paul understood that the gospel was not merely information. It was the power of God for salvation. Why Paul's story matters today. Paul's conversion is more than a historical event. It is a testimony to what God can do in any human life. His story teaches us that no one is beyond redemption. No past is too dark. No heart is too hard. No failure is too great for the grace of God. The same Jesus who met Saul on the road to Damascus is still transforming lives today. And perhaps that is why Paul's story continues to inspire believers nearly 2,000 years later. Because when God changes a person, he doesn't simply improve them. He makes them new.
You might wonder, how did a super strict Pharisee's background actually prime him to reach the Gentile world?
Paul went from bitter opponent to grace preacher. But get this, his intense core skills didn't just disappear.
God totally orchestrated Paul's secular background, his birth, education, and day job for massive gospel impact. As a strict Pharisee trained under the famous Gamaliel, Paul was literally immersed in Mosaic law.
That crazy Pharisaic zeal, it totally equipped him to expertly defend the gospel later on.
His rigorous training meant he could quote massive chunks of the Old Testament, like 4 whole passages, entirely from memory.
Beyond his Jewish roots, Paul had a huge secular advantage. He was actually born a Roman citizen.
God used that citizenship as a shield, saving Paul's life and hugely prolonging his evangelism efforts. Plus, his insane language skills, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin, let him connect seamlessly across totally diverse cultures.
He definitely didn't shy away from secular thought, expertly using Greco-Roman philosophy to defend the faith.
So why work a demanding day job? That brings us to his highly portable trade as a tent maker.
Tent making gave him financial independence, perfectly balancing his professional trade with the immense needs of growing churches.
Grace completely transformed Paul. He brought his education, trade, and citizenship right under the lordship of Christ.
And here's the massive takeaway for us. Grace doesn't erase your past. It brilliantly repurposes your background.
Just like Paul, modern believers can absolutely take their everyday secular skills and repurpose them for gospel work.
So looking at your own life, how is God going to use your unique resume to advance his glory?
As the story of Paul comes to an end, one truth shines brighter than all the rest. The road to Damascus was not just about Paul's transformation. It's about the power of God's grace. The man who once persecuted Christians became one of the greatest servants of Christ. The man who tried to silence the gospel spent the rest of his life proclaiming it. And if God could transform Saul, he can transform anyone. Perhaps you feel disqualified by your past. Perhaps you've made mistakes you wish you could erase. Perhaps you've wandered far from God and wonder if he could ever use someone like you. Paul's story answers that question. With God, no life is beyond redemption. No heart is too hard. No failure is final. The same Jesus who met Saul on the road to Damascus is still calling people today, still changing lives, still turning broken stories into testimonies of grace. So the question is not whether God can transform a life. The question is, will you respond when he calls your name?